And moving on to the market update, another green session for the Nigerian local bourse today. The NSE All share index up 0.44% today, extending the recent streak of gains, logging a 6th straight day of gains. Now, volumes were lifted by bulk trades in shares of Transcorp and Zenith Bank. Some of the gainers were 7-Up, Julius Berger, Flour Mill, Unilever, and Nigerian breweries. Well, meanwhile, the losers included WAPCO, CAP, Okomo Oil, Guaranty Trust Bank, and Cadbury. Now, for more on the activities on the boards, I'm now being joined by Abiola Razak. He's a team lead research at UBA Capital. And thanks for joining us on the show today, Abiola.
It's my pleasure, Heston.
Well, let's start with the major sentiment driving trading or the trade today at the market. What was the major sentiment, the major catalyst? 6th straight session of gains. So obviously investors are still pretty much on the bullish side.
I think the major sentiment has to do with the upcoming earnings season. Remember very well, the Q2 earnings season should kick off next week. But of course, even with that, I think it's very important to identify the fact that investors are still very cautious from the perspective of the earnings expectation. Of course, like we have our expectation that the earnings number is actually going to be a mixed bag. Yes, positive growth numbers from a couple of companies, particularly within the financial services space. But of course, we may see some declines in some food and beverage as well as some brewery companies on the bourse. And that's why investors are still cautious, even though the expectations for the Q2 earnings season is actually driving some bargain hunting in the market as we speak.
I know that, of course, momentum is building, but investors remain picky, and like you just highlighted, they still have their eyes on some specific stocks or some specific sectors. Now, for you today, what were the stocks for you that made headlines, the stocks that you think investors had their focus on today?
I think it was interesting to actually see Nigerian breweries, for instance, account for about 22% of the overall market turnover today. You remember very well Nigerian breweries have largely underperformed the market on a year-to-date basis, but it's quite interesting that over the last 3-4 trading sessions, Nigerian breweries have been on the spotlight, and today that was actually more affirmed today when we saw that increased activity level on Nigerian breweries. But it's quite interesting for the fact that in UBA Capital, currently we have a hold rating on Nigerian breweries, having peaked at 165 yesterday. We had expected that investors should remain a little cautious on that counter. It's currently trading around 33.8 times price to earnings multiple, and on the back of that, we actually have a hold rating on that counter, giving our target price of 165 naira. It closed at 170 naira today. So my expectation is that market would begin to have some level of negative sentiment on that counter, anything above the 170 levels, and that's why we just think it will stabilize around those levels over the near term.
Abiola, negative sentiment, but we did actually see a spike in value today. Remember, the last 2 weeks, both volume and value have been quite depressed, but today over 4 billion. Does that mean that investors are perhaps willing to put more money on the table as the market goes along towards the end of the week?
Yeah, you're correct, but I think it's also very important to note the fact that the valuations in the market currently now it's pretty rich, and that's why you find a lot of investors still being cautious on the market, even despite that expectation for the earnings season to actually drive performance in the market. And that's why if you look at the market over the last 2 trading sessions, it's been more of a lull, even though we've seen price gains over the last 6 trading sessions like you mentioned earlier. But of course, in terms of the activity level, it's been pretty low, largely on the back of that price evaluation that we have in the market currently now, and that's why even Nigerian breweries having crossed that 170 naira threshold, we think it would begin to have a breather at this point in time, despite that significant activity level that we saw on that counter today.
Now, is it possible that this positive sentiment, especially towards the blue chips market bellwethers, could spread to some others, not too popular sectors of the market going forward, perhaps by the end of the week?
Yeah, that's quite possible, but I think it's also very important to note the fact that for the penny stocks in particular, the bulk of the investors in the market now are actually institutional investors. The penny stocks are largely more of a retail investor play, and not so much of retail investors are out there in the market as we speak today. More of institutional play, a play of the large caps and the blue chip companies like you've mentioned earlier. But of course, going forward, our expectation is that as we see players like us, for instance, who might at some point in time want to look at possibility of maybe creating an index around the small cap companies to further give some level of appetite for those counters, and of course provide a better vehicle for investors, both retail and institutional investors, to actually invest in small cap companies, which in our own view, a good number of them have good potentials to actually outperform the market over the near to medium term. I think once we see that opportunity of creating a vehicle like a small cap index, for instance, or a small cap ETF where people can actually trade on, I think the liquidity and of course overall activity level on the small cap counters may then increase. But in the short term, I actually don't expect so much of price rally, particularly in the small cap counters.
Abiola, before I let you go, one quick one. Let's talk about one or two market activities or events that could shape trading for the rest of the week. Remember that federal government bond auction this week, and of course inflation rate that we're expecting. The market is expecting tomorrow 9%, and we might be looking at a lower inflation rate for the month of June. How, in terms of how the market is going to react, what are your thoughts on that?
Our expectations for the June inflation figure, which should be released tomorrow, to actually settle around the 8.7% levels, and that's largely on the back of the harvest season and of course the high base effect in 2012. But given that, as it were, the downside to inflation for June is actually the increase in the electricity tariff that we saw in June, and of course Naira volatility. Remember very well, the Naira did depreciated about 2.7% in June 2013, and of course on the back of that we may see some pressure point for the inflation rate. But of course, largely, like I said, we're still expecting 8.7% inflation rate. I think the reaction to that will actually be muted in the market, given the fact that at this point in time, inflation actually has less impact on the fixed income market, particularly the bonds market, given the fact that we already have a positive real rate. And I think anything 8.6, 8.7% levels for the inflation rate is actually not going to be a surprise to the market. And that's why I think the impact is actually going to be muted tomorrow by the time the numbers are released.